My name is Greg Kruger. I'm the cropping system specialist out at the West Central Research and Extension Center in North Platte. At this stop, I'm going to have Dr. Charles Shapiro with me. He's the soil scientist out of the Northeast Research and Extension Center up in Concord. Today we're going to talk about a couple different things. The main emphasis is going to be on row spacing and nitrogen management. We've got a lot to cover. Kept the last group an extra 10 minutes, so I'm going to have to talk twice as fast to you guys to get you out for lunch in time. So, first off, before we get started, just out of curiosity, how many of you guys are planting 30-inch rows or wider?
Wider?
Wider? Anybody? 36? 40? 30s? How many of you are 15 inches or 18 inches, somewhere in that range? Any of you less than that? 7.5? Anybody drilling them?
8 inch.
8 inch? What made you choose the row spacing that you're in?
Early canopy.
Early canopy? And you're 15 inches or 15s? Anybody else?
Erosion control.
Erosion control? 15 inches too?
Yeah.
Anybody else?
That was a drill I had.
The drill you had?
Yeah.
You couldn't sell the drill.
What's that?
Couldn't sell the drill, so
No, I bought it from a guy
you
that
bought it from somebody.
otherwise had a 36.
You had
15 is better yield.
15s are better yields, and that's exactly what we're going to talk about today. I should let you stand up here and give this. No, in the last 2 years we've worked on it quite extensively, looking at row spacing. If you guys were fortunate enough to make one of the Soybean Management Field Days last year or the year before, you saw some of the row spacing work. How much more do you suppose it yields?
15%.
15%? Little high from what we've seen, but real close. Over the last 2 years, at each of the 4 sites, we've had studies looking at row spacing. And across those 8 studies, we found somewhere between about 5 and 10% yield increase with 15-inch row spacing versus 30-inch row spacing. Now, we've also done a few studies looking at narrower rows, the 7.5s, and what we find, if you keep everything the same except for the row spacing, so we're using the same piece of equipment, we get about 3 or 4% higher yields with the 7.5s over the 15s. Now, the one caveat is when we go from a 7.5 or from a 15 to a 7.5, we usually switch from a planter to a drill, right? What happens with the seed depth uniformity and the seed spacing uniformity? And we lose that, right? And when we do that, we do lose some of that yield potential. So I'm not going to tell you to go out and plant 7.5s, but certainly if you're in 30s, there's an opportunity to pick up another 5 or 10% by going to a 15-inch row. Now, those of you that are going to retire in the next 3 to 4 years probably can't pencil that out in terms of buying a new planter to do that. If you're looking at a new planter though in your program or in your operation, I certainly would encourage you to look at a 15-inch row. Now, I say that, and guess what? Not every situation is conducive for a 15-inch row. A study out of the University of Illinois 2 years ago reported 30 to 40% higher yields in 30-inch rows versus 15s. Situation was a little unique though. In that particular case, they were looking at white mold, and what they found is they got much better control of white mold when they had wider row spacing. So not every situation is perfect for a 15-inch row. Some places we want a little bit wider row spacing. By and large, what we're going to see is higher yields in narrower rows. If you have white mold, the reason the authors speculated that they're seeing that is that they get greater airflow through the canopy. That greater airflow through the canopy reduces the disease incidence. So that's one example where you might not want to go to a narrow row. But by and large, from what we've seen across Nebraska, that narrow row spacing is going to pay off every time. A couple other things that we've looked at over the last few years. Last year we looked at plant population. We looked at a range of plant populations from seeding rates of 75,000 up to 250,000 seeds per acre. What I'll tell you is 75,000, you're going to give up some yield. At 250,000, we were seeing all kinds of lodging problems. Somewhere in between there, you probably want to find a home. That's a pretty wide range, right? So what we did, we took the yield data that we had, we put together some analysis looking at the economic component, tried to find the best current seed prices that we could on an average bag of seed, tried to take the current market prices, and over a smaller range, we found somewhere between about 125 to 150,000 plants at harvest to be the optimal. So as you guys know, every system, every planter, every field's a little bit different in terms of how uniform or how good the emergence is, how high those emergence rates are. So you want to target probably somewhere between 125 and 150,000 plants per acre at the end of the season. Now, how many of you guys were at one of these sites 2 years ago? Nobody. Oh, I was going to say, if nobody was here, I can really embellish the story. But I guess I got a few that are going to hold my feet to the fire. 2 years ago, we had a study where we were looking at alternative practices to increase yields. We were looking at strobilurin applications. We were looking at planting depths, things like that. One of the things that we were looking at, if you remember, was we were looking at clipping that apical meristem, or using a PPO inhibitor to kill that apical meristem. There's been a lot of stuff reported recently about using different methods to clip that apical meristem or kill that apical meristem to induce branching. And by inducing branching, those plants would support higher yields. What we found is it's probably not a good route to go unless you're looking to get out of the field just a little bit earlier in the fall, because we got about 3 to 4% yield decreases from doing that. That apical meristems, where that growing point is, we clip out some of that those small leaves. We're losing some of that wheelhouse or that factory that we build up to try to build yields at the end of the season. So I'm going to tell you today, if we want to manage for high yields, there's certainly better ways to do it than killing the apical meristem on that plant to induce branching. Now, with that said, I want to talk just a few minutes about what we've done in terms of continuing the replicated trials that Keith talked about first thing this morning. This year we've done something a little bit different. We've gone to what we're calling an integrated study. This year, myself, Dr. Shapiro on the nutrient management side, Dr. Giesler and Dr. Wright on the entomology and plant pathology side have all got together and said we want to understand what the interactions are in different systems. Maybe it pays to put down that strobilurin application late in the season in a 30-inch row versus, or a 15-inch row where it may not pay quite as well doing it in a 30-inch row. So, or maybe there's an interaction between insecticides and fungicides late in the season if we put them down together. So those are the kind of things that we were wanting to address. The challenge with that is when you take 4 different scientists, you get 4 different opinions on how things should be done. What we ended up with was the conglomeration of what 4 different opinions come out to be. The study that we've developed, you can see out to the right where we've got a few field signs. We ended up with a study with 60 different systems in it. Okay? The first thing we did is we looked at systems at 15 and 30-inch row spacing. So we got 30 systems in each. And those different systems include applications at planting and mid-season. The at planting applications are a fungicide seed treatment, a non-treated seed, a fungicide plus an insecticide seed treatment, and then both of those in combination with nitrogen down at planting. Now we did the same thing mid-season, looking at fungicide applications, insecticide applications, and nutrient applications in all combinations. Okay, so like I said, what we're really trying to do is try to understand how those integrated systems can be used to maximize economic and agronomic return. So I'm going to save talking about this study in more detail at this point, because I want to talk a little bit more about what we saw and what we're seeing at this location out in the field plots. So at this point, I think I'll turn it over to Dr. Shapiro, let him talk a little bit about the nitrogen management components, and then we'll take you out to the field plots and see what we're up to. Are there any questions as he's coming up about row spacing or the work that we've done over the last 2 years? No questions.
Did you find anything in your trials about seed depth?
Did we find anything in our trials about seed depth? Seed depth is one that we haven't looked at. So I really can't speak to any kind of research that we've done there. So maybe something, I'd certainly encourage you to put that down as a comment on the evaluation form at the end of the day, and we'll take that into consideration. If you guys see or think of other things that we haven't looked at that we should be, would love to have that information, so make sure you put that down at the end of the day.
Thanks, Greg. You know, I've been listening to Greg talk about that integrated study for the last 3.5 days, and he always says there are 4 scientists with 4 opinions, but it's probably more like 8 opinions. Because even us individually, we usually have at least 2. So it just makes it harder to get that all done. But what I want to talk about today is going to be focused on nitrogen in soybeans. We do have the integrated study. We have a nitrogen study. The title has micronutrients in it. We've done some work with micronutrients last couple of years, and we do have a little bit of manganese on the soybeans, but I'm not going to spend a lot of time on that. I just get too enthusiastic about nitrogen. I never have time for the micronutrients. And I'm also going to focus or try to bring the discussion into why we are interested in nitrogen in the high yield situations, when in the past we haven't really spent a lot of time worrying about nitrogen in soybeans. Now, those of you who've heard me before or listened to my colleagues in the soil science nutrient management, you know, we really can't give a talk without recommending taking soil tests and looking at the results and helping you plan whatever you're going to do. So we took soil samples at all the 4 sites at the Soybean Management Field Day. I think it's important that when you look at the data and when you look at what the results are, you have some idea about the conditions in which it grows. This certainly doesn't give all the data. I don't know, have you been to the irrigation one yet? Yeah. So they talked about the texture, right? Silt, sandy, all that kind of thing. Well, we're looking here more at nutrients than the physical properties, but they all work together. Really, no big problems at any of the sites. From my point of view, the worst problem is the fact that this is a little bit acid. And for soybeans, you want to get it up closer to 6.5, probably over 6 for sure. It doesn't have to be 6, 7, save a little line by keeping it a little lower. But once you get down to the 5, 6, you will make it a more tougher environment for those microbes to do their work. There may be other issues, but for soybeans, the acid soils inhibit the bacteria from growing as well as at other pHs. This site has a history of manure, very high P and K levels. Not sure that you get into any plant problems with 715 part per million of phosphorus, but probably I'll be long dead before that thing would be drawn down to where they would need phosphorus, because it's a long way to get to 15 from 715. But anyway, there's not a lot of other issues. We did have some higher nitrates when we were at Holdridge, and that may inhibit the early growth of the nodules, which we're talking about today. But otherwise, not too much. At Pierce, one thing to point out, people have asked a number of times whether there's any micronutrient issues. From a soil testing point of view, we use a 0.5 as a critical level in the soil. So this is a little bit under 0.5. Whether adding boron would help out here in terms of yields, I don't know. It's really close. We just don't have a lot of research to back up using boron. Not because we have negative research, we just don't have a lot of it either way. So the main thing that we're going to be talking about is soybeans, and soybeans are grown in rotation with a number of crops, mostly corn. How many people here only grow soybeans? No one. Now, Vic, you only grow soybeans?
On some acres, for isolation.
But you do grow some corn.
Yes.
You do grow some corn. Well, Victor's sitting there. Soybean Board is paying my salary today, more or less. At least they're giving me lunch. So I'm supposed to talk about soybeans. But I do take a little segue and talk about corn, because there is an end credit from soybeans into corn. So that is part of the value of your soybean crop, is into the future grass crop. Could be wheat, mostly it's corn around here. So how many people take a credit for soybeans in their corn crop? How much do you use?
Pound per bushel.
Pound per bushel? Anybody use a fixed number? Anybody know what the university recommends? 30. We recommend 45 in our equation. If you went to the website or got a Neb guide or used a little slide rule, whatever, we usually say 45 pounds if it's a decent crop. If it's an indecent crop, under 20, it would be half that. Now, a pound per bushel is something that we've heard, all through the week, and when yields were in the 40, 50 range, it really is about the same. So it's not a bad number. But I'm glad you're using that credit, but what I'm going to be talking about today more is not really the rotation effect, but the internal nitrogen balance when you're growing soybeans, regardless of what it does to the future crop. Now I have this jar. What is this now? Is this the 14th time I've been carrying it around? I'm over 60 years old, and they're telling us now to be good teachers you have to have props and visuals so people can see what you're saying, because they don't want to just look at graphs and things. So what do I have in here?
Urea.
Urea, oh good. How much N is in urea?
46.
46. You're a fertilizer dealer, right? All right. Okay, so there's 8.25 pounds of urea in here. How much N is that?
Well, a little under half.
Right, so it's 3.5 if you do the math. Now we've been here, this is the fourth day, get a little punch drunk, but I expected that somebody, when I ask the question, will pull out their smartphone and do the numbers, because if I'm in high school, that's what they do. But I guess you're just not, no one has actually done that to do the math, which is surprising. But anyway, why am I carrying around 8 pounds of urea? Now one guy the other day said, because it's lighter than 10 pounds. And then the other guy said, because you're trying to make a point. And I said, yeah, what's the point? He didn't have an answer, but why am I carrying 8 pounds of urea around? Or 3.5 pounds of nitrogen?
Crazy.
Well, that too. Some things are not mutually exclusive, but that wasn't the answer I was looking for. Now, Greg's heard me do this 14 times, so he does think I'm crazy. But that's the number. That's the amount of nitrogen that each bushel of soybeans takes with it when it leaves the field. So, you can do the math at 40 bushels or 80 bushels, but there's a lot of N leaving. And this is just what's in the soybeans. This doesn't include growing the plant or in the roots. So there's a lot of N, even though 95% of us worry about N when we're growing corn. We've never in the past really worried. You inoculate your soybeans and all is good. And I'm not going to say that's wrong or that you're going to have to stay up night worrying about putting nitrogen on soybeans. My point is going to be that you have to understand the math and the budget of what's going on out there with nitrogen, because you want to manage it so you can get as much free nitrogen from that N fixation as possible. So we will go out to the field, look at the studies, and then we're going to come back and address these questions. How much is fixed? Maybe how much is in the stover? How much comes from the soil? And see if it all adds up. Yeah.
When I have that October hailstorm come through and it lays 50 bushels of soybeans in the field, then I have 200 and some bushels of nitrogen for next year's corn crop?
200 pounds, that's in the beans. So the question there, and that's a good, I've tried to get the soybean board. It's fun to study where I just spread different rates of soybeans on the field in September, but they just won't bite. But, the question would be, how fast that comes available in the spring,
right.
Where does it go? I mean, that soybean is a little resistant. If it sprouts, if it's mature enough so that it's a full seed, it might sprout and all. So how much comes available and when would be a question. But there's a lot in there, for sure. So let's go to the field, and we'll talk about the integrated study and then the nitrogen.
All right, guys, the first thing I want to do is just describe what we've done out here. I think it's important to understand how we do things and why we do things in addition to just what we found. So I want to take just a few minutes to lay out what we've done out here. We put out signs in front of the plots. These signs are sitting in the middle of a 10-foot wide plot. So on the 15-inch row spacings, we have 7 rows. On the 30-inch row spacing, that sign will be sitting in the middle of 4 rows. The plots are about 30 foot long. If you look back there, you can kind of see where there's a dip in the canopy. That's the end of the first range of plots. We've replicated everything out here 4 times so that we have good sound number of replications. But one of the challenges that we run into is that we identify these sites in April. By the time we get soil samples in and out, we're at the first week of May when we want to be planting these studies, or maybe even a little bit behind when we'd like to ideally be planting these studies, and we just never know exactly what we're going to get. One of the things you see here is a lot of variability in the field. Those aren't due necessarily to the treatments, but more so to the soil that we're dealing with here. We're fortunate that the other 3 sites we really weren't seeing this variability, and I'll tell you that we really couldn't see any difference between any of the plots in terms of visual appearance at any of the other 3 locations. So everybody looked at us funny because we were dragging them out to show them plots where we couldn't see anything. But I want you guys to see this because when you come back to our crop production clinics this winter, you'll understand exactly what we did, what those plots looked like, and how the data turned out. Now, in the front of the plots, you can see we've got 4 rows of beans going the opposite direction. We do that just so that we can put a border around the plot so that we don't have that edge effect on that first range of plots, giving those first range of plots an extra yield advantage. Now, on the signs, we've listed out the fertility treatments. You'll see a little number handwritten in the bottom left-hand corner. That's telling you, and that'll give you some information on exactly what we've done to that plot. Keep in mind we've got 30 different systems in each of the 15 and 30-inch row spaces that we've got. So that number, if you turn to page 8 in your book, there's a table at the top of that page, and those numbers will correspond to the exact treatments that we put onto those plots. If you're just curious as to what we've got. Now, one of the things that we've really talked about this morning, and I want to continue to emphasize, is that difference between the 15 and the 30-inch row spacing. And if you'll look on my left-hand side, you guys' right, we've got those 15-inch row spacings. On my right, you guys' left, we switch over to the 30-inch row spacings. Some of you guys that are standing kind of down here, right in between the 2, what do you notice different between the 2 plots? Canopy, right? We would have never known, but this was the perfect year and the perfect site to demonstrate that point. You can see a lot of variability in terms of field site and location, but in terms of demonstrating that importance of developing a canopy, this was absolutely perfect. Couldn't have worked out any better. Which one's got a better canopy? Which one are we getting greater light interception on? 15. The 15. So just like we talked about this morning, that light interception leads to greater photosynthetic rates, more light capture, and that's translating into those higher yields that we're seeing. The data that we've pulled off of these studies the last 2 years corresponds really well with the data that's coming out of Minnesota, Wisconsin, Indiana, Illinois, Missouri, Mississippi, and Arkansas, where they've been doing similar studies to this over the last 4 years, seeing very similar results. Now, somebody asked me a very good question yesterday. I unfortunately didn't cover that with the groups we had the first 2 days, but somebody asked me which sites are seeing the most yield increase, the northern states or the southern states? What do you guys think? Which states? The northern states. That's exactly right. In those northern states, we've got a shorter growing season, and we've got less time to capture that sunlight and convert it into yield. So those northern states are seeing a greater yield advantage from the narrow rows. Now, the reason I said this is an absolute perfect time or year and location to demonstrate this, what happened early this spring in this area? We got a lot of rain, right? We got planted late. So held out of the field, planted late. So we lost that early part of the growing season. What's happened in season? I'm not demonstrating it right now, but all week I've had my coat on. We've had cool weather. That cool weather slows down the growth and development of that plant. That's led to slower canopy and a greater difference between the 15 and 30-inch rows. So this was an absolute, I didn't plant it this way. Would have loved to have some warm temperature. I hate wearing my coat at Soybean Management Field Days in August, but this worked out absolutely perfectly for demonstrating that importance of that narrow row spacing. So, like I said, if you guys are switching equipment, getting new planters, this is a perfect opportunity to increase the number of bushels that you're bringing home. Any questions about what we've done in this particular study? Anything I forgot, Charles?
Did you talk about the nitrogen rates?
I didn't talk about the nitrogen rates.
Why you need a soils guy?
Soil side.
Okay, the 2 times that were put on was when they were doing the foliar insecticide and fungicide. And at planting there was about 17 pounds of nitrogen spread after they planted it, so it wasn't with the seed. And then when they did the late N, it was UAN with drop nozzles between the rows, so there wasn't anything on the foliar. There was also a small amount of foliar sprayed on. They used a product called Enrage at 2 gallons per acre, and I think that has about 2.5 pounds of N per gallon, plus it has a little P, K, and manganese.
In terms of, if you have questions about the insecticides or fungicides, hang on to them. When you get to the next stop, first stop after lunch, there's going to be more discussion on that particular aspect of it. Certainly Charles and I don't want to deal with any disease or insect questions. We're afraid the advice you get there is going to be pretty bad.
Right.
So if there's no other questions, I'm going to get you guys to migrate on down here. We want to talk a little bit about the nutrient management study that we put out.
Okay, what you have in front of you is a nitrogen rate study. It's on the bottom of page 7 of your booklet, and we designed this study to be a companion to the one you just looked at. We like to do rates of nutrients just like they do rates of herbicides and other inputs, rates of population, but in that big study we were not able to put rates of anything because it just make it gigantic and not feasible. So we made another N-rate study where we put on what they considered the highest inputs of the big study, where we had fungicide and insecticide early and fungicide and insecticide late, and then we varied the nitrogen rate early or late. Early is at planting. All of it was urea dropped with a drop spreader, but at the late one, which would have been about 3 weeks ago, they hand spread it onto the plots as urea. One of the things we've been looking at all week is the effect of N on nodules. This is a 0 plot. Theoretically, these plants without any N should have, if they don't have more nodules, they should be, being more active. And it's pretty hard to make that kind of comparison. They want us to do. Where's Victor? Is he here yet? They want us to do hands-on things, so Greg thought we should bring about 30 shovels and have everybody dig up roots and wash them and count them for us, but we got vetoed on that idea. So you'll just have, I just dug up one. Greg seemed to always leave when the shovel came in. But, so we've looked at it. There's really, I can't say that this one has more nodules than the one Greg has from the high input one. What I noticed on this one is you look at, there's a pretty good compacted deal. That taproot is not going the right direction, which has nothing to do with the nitrogen treatment. But if you want to check your nodules for activity, you can take a nodule out with a knife, or if you have good thumbnails, you can cut them in half, and they should be pink. Not all of them are going to be pink, because new ones, I think, come through the season, and old ones slough off and die, and they, you can tell that it's necrotic material, it's brown, dead, but you can usually find some that'll turn pink. So this isn't really, it's a demonstration that maybe, there's a little bit of difference, but the purpose was not, the purpose of adding N is not to inhibit the nodules, but that kind of happens naturally.
The nodule has just a pinkish tone to it. bit loses that pinkish tone. It's got a brown, a gray, or a black tone to it. That's telling us that nodule's no longer working, but you can see this is probably starting to shut down. Over the next few weeks, you'll see those nodules will start to shut down over the course of the season. I lost him.
They're kind of small.
Now you see why I disappear when the shovel comes out.
Well, Greg's cutting that up. If you want to just take a look at your brochure on page 7, right above the treatments, I put 2 tables of previous research conducted up in the northeast part of the state, because that's where I do most of my work. The one on your left there, the 3-year average was on a sandy site, low organic matter, but it had nitrates in the water, and so we figured they put on about 50 pounds of N every year, whether they wanted it or not, because of the irrigation water. And you can see between 0 and 100 pounds, there wasn't more than a bushel difference, and that's an average of 3 years. So, you know, maybe R1 is actually too early. I guess I'm kind of like a lot of people. I like to get my work done and get it on, but it may be better to actually wait later. Most of the research says that R5 is when those nodules are at their peak production. So to get advantage, you probably have to go later, which this is pretty late in the season to be adding nitrogen, but maybe that's the way to do it. The other study is kind of interesting. That's a long-term study we have up at the Northeast Station. It's a corn-soybean rotation. And the N rates you see there are actually on the corn year. And I noticed doing the statistics that 4 of those 25 years I actually increased yields in the soybeans by the previous N rate on the corn. There's no N on the soybeans. Now I put the 25 mean yield there. It shows maybe 1 bushel difference, but in those years where it was significant, there was a little bit more than 1 bushel difference. I'm not sure whether it's the nitrogen residual or whether there's something else going on, because that 0 N plot with the corn is going to be a little bit different than the high N plot in terms of a lot of things, residue and that kind of thing. So that's just kind of an interesting artifact of the study with N. We've done other N studies. Actually, the Soybean Board supported one a few years ago where, again, we got about 2.5 bushels yield increase in the areas where we got yield increases, but we didn't get yield increases every year. Any questions on that? Okay, let's move into the tent and we'll finish up there. I'm going to bring the discussion back to those nodules again and just make some comments about them for your general knowledge. They don't start functioning until V2 stage, and that's when they begin. So if you have a situation where you don't think you have enough N in the soil to get the crop to V2, that might be a reason to put a little bit of N on. It would be a special case because most of these soils, will have enough residual, so it's not something that you would have to do. But they don't. It does take a little bit of time for the soybeans nodules to form, but it's not really late in the season. The other point I wanted to make is that it takes energy, even though we want to get as much of that free nitrogen into the plant as possible. It does cost something in terms of the physiology of the soybean plant, because you take a plant, you have green leaves, it's photosynthesizing, it has to take the photosynthate from the green leaves, go down the stem into the roots, get the sugars to the nodules, then the nodules use that sugar to combine the nitrogen from the air to make the protein, and then that material has to go back up to the leaves or to the grain. And so it takes energy, which means if you didn't have to spend that energy moving the sugars around, it could go right into the leaf to make more leaves grow quicker and could potentially make more grain. Now, the fellow in the last session asked, well, how much is it? And I said, I have no idea. So I don't know whether you're dealing with a half bushel or, I just have no idea. It takes less energy, though, for the roots to take up nitrates directly from the soil. So that's one of the reasons why if you have high nitrates in the soil, the roots are going to take them up. It's basically they're getting that for free and they're having to pay for this. So most of us will take the free food before we have to pay to make the food. Now you have to pay to supply the nitrates, but the soybean plant doesn't care that you're paying for that nitrogen. So whether we inhibit, I think there's some inhibition of the enzymes in the plant that send messages to the nodules to produce. The point being that there is some energy to do this, and that the nitrates are preferred. So with that in mind, we're going to return to looking at the nitrogen budget for the whole production of the crop. And I'm pretty lucky that there was a group in Lincoln, Dr. Speck and some of the others, and a grad student did what's called a meta-analysis about 5 years ago. They looked at all the publications in the science journals that studied nitrogen budgeting, where the N came from to get into the beans. And they found about 105 studies that were published in the 10-year period. And they summarized some of these things. And it's a really interesting paper, because it looks at more than just one field, one state. It looks at the whole soybean growing world. Now that may not be directly applicable to your particular farm, so you have to take a grain of salt here. There's always variation, but it gives you an idea about the soybean plant, what it's capable of. So they split the data into what's called quartiles. So this is the lower quarter of the data, this is the average of the middle half, and this is the average of the upper half. And back then it came out to be 30, 50, 40, 50 bushels. If we look at the numbers, what they mean is this column here is the total N going into the plant. So obviously, as you increase yields, you increase the total amount of N that you need for that field. They use the average from here of about 52% of the N is fixed. So this is the removal amount, this is the amount fixed, and they're about equal. So as you increase your yields, you're increasing your fixation, but it's the same percentage. The problem that we have is this column here, which is the soil supply. And as this difference gets bigger between here and here, we're relying on more and more soil N to make up the difference. Or you have to put fertilizer, but most people don't put fertilizer on soybeans, so most of it comes from the soil. So I had showed you before, there's about 2% organic matter here, plus or minus. If they're going to grow corn like they are over there, but they're not going to put any nitrogen on this field, just the regular inputs, weed control and all that, how much corn do you think they'd grow here without any N? At 2% soil. I'm not recommending this.
10 bushel an acre.
How much?
10 bushel.
10 bushel. I hear 10. Do I hear 20? 30? 40? Are we going to sell it to him for 10? Okay, you said 10. My long-term research up at the research station there, which probably has a little less rainfall than here on average, but it's rain-fed, 25 inches a year average. I looked at some long-term studies that I've had in plots for over 20 years or so, and I had N rates, and one of those N rates is nothing. So I have parts of fields up there that have had 0 N for 20 years in corn soybean rotation. Anyway, I did the math, and I'm getting about 25 pounds of N per percent organic matter when you look at 3 different long-term studies. So this gentleman is a little short there. I would say 50 bushels, maybe, on 2%. It's not all going to be 2%, so there's going to be varied. Our nitrogen recommendation equation for a 200 bushel corn crop actually credits about 28 pounds per percent organic matter. So it could be as much as 30 pounds of, 60 pounds here at 2%. Whatever the number is, whether it's 60 pounds of N or 50 pounds of N and this is only 50 bushels. At 50 bushels, they're talking about 325 pounds of total N, and here you have about 200 pounds of fixed and removed. Well, if I do the math, 325 minus 200 and minus 200 is what? 125. And we're saying 60 comes from the soil. So where's the other 60 coming from? You know, and if you increase your yield, you're saying, well, 50 is nothing. I want 80 or 100. Unless this number increases, the deficit between the soil and what the plant needs gets bigger. And so that is what you know, what scientists who are studying this kind of wonder about, because there's a limit to the amount of fixation, or at least we don't really know what the limit is, and we don't know some things about the process. But we do know, that's why this study this is a grad student, and then the other people were the people in Lincoln who put together the numbers. It's a great paper. If anyone's really interested, I can get you the citation, or where you can find it on the web. The biggest problem with it is that it's all in metric units. So you have to slug through megagrams per hectare, kilograms per hectare. If you're not used to those kind of numbers, it's a little bit challenging. So I converted most of those numbers into English here, the ones of interest. And I have two columns, 40 bushel yield and an 80. You can spend some time going through this so you can see how the numbers add up. If you use 40 bushels times 60 pounds per bushel, and this 6.3% is what I was talking about here, you end up with about 150 pounds of N actually being removed every year in a bushel of soy in your soybean field at this level of yield. There is some N in the residue that stays on the field, and there is N in the roots. Now, most of the time we don't talk about the root N. In fact, when I was reading the paper, this is the first time I actually saw someone put numbers on it. It's really hard to get data like that. It's really easy to go out there and clip those plants and dry them and send them to the lab. But if you want to dig up all the roots, clean them, that's a lot of work. The sandy soil is a lot easier, but if you go to a silt loam or silty clay loam, it's really hard to do the root work. So my hat's off to those who have done the work. They came up with 24%. So I use that. And so if you add up all this, there's about 257 pounds that we have to count for. Now, if we use this 52%, which is what they used here, this is 52 down here. There's 133 pounds of N produced by those nodules. Now, if you compare this number to this 152, which you remove, you get a minus 19. That's a deficit. There's 19 pounds less N in the soil after you grow the soybean crop. Now, a half an hour ago, I told you there's a 45-pound credit. So what's Shapiro doing up here, talking out of both sides of his mouth? One time he says it's a 45-pound credit, and then half an hour later he's saying there's 20 pounds less there. What's going on?
You haven't taken into account the residue and the root.
The residue or the roots. Yeah, there's N left over that'll be available, and maybe it's this 43 pounds that are there that the crop will use, but the total loss is, there's still going to be a loss of N. So even though this is more available maybe than following corn, when you still have a net loss. What I'm really talking about here is that with corn, it grows better following soybeans, and it grows better with less nitrogen, and we can document it. And all our 95% of our studies show that we have a credit. We call it a soybean credit because that's what we called it 30 years ago. But I like to call it a corn penalty, because we really have a penalty with all that corn residue that we're planting into, all that carbon on the soil. It's cooler in the spring. It's just not as good an environment for growing in a rotation. And there's a lot of other reasons in the rotation why we do better than the N. So the 45-pound credit, or the pound per bushel, or the 40 pounds, whatever you want to use, works. It's a functional number. It may not actually be adding N to the soil. Now, if you grew alfalfa or something, you might, another legume may be actually adding N. But the soybean math doesn't work. What's interesting is if you look at the high yield situation, 80 bushels here, What they found in the paper, and I don't know if it's going to be true all the time, but they actually found a higher level of protein at the high yield situations than at the 40. And the question is, why would you have higher protein at higher yield levels? If you're growing wheat or growing corn, you'd expect the protein level to be diluted. And that's what I would expect. I talked to one of the co-authors of the paper, and they thought that you should look at it this way. This is a really high functioning, great soybean field, and this one has some kind of limiting factor. And so it's not at full speed. It's like comparing an athlete to a regular person. You know, if you're an athlete, your oxygen use is much more efficient. You're stronger and faster than me, and you're also more efficient than me. So you can think of it that way. I don't know if in all cases this is going to be true. This is what the data they reported was. So I use their data to calculate not at 50, but the numbers for 80. And some guy on Tuesday or Wednesday said, well, I already get 85. I want to see those numbers for 100. So I'm just using this as an example. If you do all the math, keep this the same, we're talking here 530 pounds of N that we have to think about, or that soybean crop has to corral sometime through its existence every year. So that's a big number. That's more than your 200 bushel of corn is going to corral or need. So it's really important, if we're going to get to these high levels, that all this is working. Now the paper also showed, reported that at this higher level, it was getting 69% fixation, which is way more than the 52 that we really assume. If you do that and believe that they're getting a higher nodulation, and again, the authors told me a lot of the high yield situations might have been in places where they didn't have soils with a lot of organic matter to release in. So the nodules basically had to produce more than what they do around here. Well, if you believe that and do the math here, we actually get a 44-pound credit when we soup up the protein here, soup up the N in the residue, and have a higher fixation. So I didn't set these numbers up to come close to 45, it just kind of worked out that way. Now, you may not actually believe that that you can soup it all up and get the higher level. So if you were going to use these numbers at the 80 bushel range, you'd have less all along here, and you end up with a 54-pound deficit. So people who are getting 80 bushels probably, and are not, you know, putting on in, it'll take a long time before you would actually see this in terms of your soils, but they're probably, you know, closer to here. I don't know, I have to do the math. But if you do the more conventional, you're going to be at a loss. So I only mention this here so you understand that in the high yield situation, a lot is going on. Now, what can we do to manage this? You know, it's all fine and dandy to look at all these numbers, but is there something that you can do? Now, the same people here, this guy was a grad student, and he had to actually do real research, not just read. So one of his studies was to try to fool the nodules, because when you these numbers come from no N experiments, but when you start putting N in the experiment, these numbers go down. So the 50 would become a 45 because of that lack of additiveness. So he said, okay, let's fool the nodules. How can we do that? So he got some fertilizers, polycoated urea, which is sold as ESN, which is a slow release material, maybe over 60 days, depending on the temperature. And he put it in underneath the seed furrow about 8 inches, and then he planted above that. And hoping that the plant would grow, the nodules would form, everything would be good, and then in mid-season that urea would start to come available, and it would not be where the nodules were, and everything would work better. He also compared that to putting ammonium nitrate on at about R5. And he was able to increase yields 5%. And his check yield was 71 bushels where he didn't put any nitrogen. So 5% of that is 3.5 bushels, which is all well and good, but he put out 160 pounds of N to get that 3.5 bushels. So it's not really economic at this point, and same thing with the ammonium nitrate late. And not all studies get you that 5% yield increase, but this one did. It was an average over 2 years. This study here looked at how much N it took to get yield increases when they had studies that had yield increases, because you know, you don't want to have to go 160. What they found was that it really, in the sites where they had like rates of N, it didn't really matter whether they put 25 or 30 pounds as compared to 100 pounds. They got that response with a low level of N, which, you know, again, then we have to ask other sets of questions. What's going on? Because we have this big deficit to get between what the crop needs and what we're fixing. You know, if you still have this math here, the difference between these two numbers has to be supplied by something. And so that's 160 pounds right there. And the soil is not going to produce 160 pounds, right? That's 150 bushels of corn. So we still don't know what's going on, even if we have the best soils going on and if we have a really good case of nodulation. So you would think that more N would be better to get closer to making all this balance. But they really never found studies where more N was more yield. It was either like a switch on-off. So I can't leave you with, you know, take-home message, put on 20 pounds. That's not it. But if you are going to try it, you have to look at the staging, and I would recommend trying it later more than earlier, because the nodules start to taper off their activity. I think the leaves still are functioning a little bit longer, and so there's a window there between when the nodules slow down and when the crop matures. But there's not, you know, it's not 3 weeks. I don't know what it is, but it's probably closer to 10 days. And so the question would be, how much yield bump is possible? My guess is it's not 10 to 20 bushels. It's probably 5 bushels. So you've got to also think about that. Any questions? You're hungry, huh? Okay, time to eat. Thank you.